those of you who haven't been in a potentially dangerous situation, it's a whole other feeling. You just go into a different mode, and a lot of people, they don't know how to handle that. And that's also a problem. I believe police officers should have much more training before they are allowed to practice. And then, of course, there's a 1 out of 10, like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, like those cases, of course, those officers should be prosecuted. But when it comes to jiu-jitsu, I believe that it would allow them to have more time for training. It takes about 4 to 5 years to get a purple belt, and it allow them to have the tools to de-escalate the situation safely.
I know one big problem right now with the police officers is that they go to academy for like 3 months and then they don't have to do any training once they're in the force.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have a higher threshold with the purple belt. And then also I have heard the idea like 1/5 of a police officer's time should be spent on like retraining. So whether that's like 1 day of the week or like 1 or 2 hours that they spend on the day, they're going through like conflict scenarios where they're able to learn these de-escalation tactics, because like even if you're in the force and you have a purple belt, like you're going to get rusty about being able to control someone's body if you're not practicing jiu-jitsu or like being able to understand how to de-escalate. So I think that'd be really important.
Yeah,
But,
I think a lot of. Sorry,
yeah.
you're gonna say something?
No.
Well, I think a lot of the de-escalation is just having the confidence and the assurance in your own ability to de-escalate, so that you don't have to pull out a weapon, or you don't have to get 10 guys to get one guy down, or do anything extra. You know what I mean? And then when it actually comes to a physical altercation, having the skills is important, and having the right procedures and know what to do is very important. I think they should focus on retraining, but at the same time, in an actual incident, a lot of that goes out the window. So it just comes down to how much you train and how comfortable you are with that. As an officer.
In the case with Derek Chauvin, do you think which tactics of reform or training would have been effective to prevent the death of George Floyd if we had hindsight?
Well, I think with George Floyd, he was immobilized for 8 minutes straight. I think in that case, Derek Chauvin was obviously and he had past complaints. He was obviously that shouldn't have happened. He should be prosecuted. He should be incarcerated, I believe. And I believe that he had that situation under control. I mean, George Floyd wasn't going to do anything. He should have just had him in cuffs, and that should have been it. So in that situation, that wasn't an adrenaline pump situation. He was perfectly fine, and he just chose to keep, putting his knee on the guy's neck. And unfortunately, so that's, in my opinion, that's almost like a hate crime. I think you could definitely say that's racism, right there.
I think that's part of why it was upped from 3rd-degree murder to 2nd-degree murder, because you could tell he had intent to kill. And I've heard people go as far to say it should be up to 1st-degree murder, because we saw George Floyd and Chauvin actually had worked together previously at they were security guards at a club, I believe. And Floyd found issue with the way that Chauvin was practicing, like he was always escalating the situation. So there was conflict with them in a previous work environment, which I thought very interesting, and nobody's really talking about that. But I think you could, as a prosecution, make the argument to up it to a 1st-degree case. But did you agree with them upping it to 2nd-degree in the first place?
I definitely do agree with that. And also, there's a difference between not knowing how to de-escalate and intentionally escalating, or like in that case. I think that, again, that should not have happened. He should be prosecuted. And I think, but that doesn't go for all cops. There's a few bad apples, just like anyone else. I think the problem is the systemic racism in the district attorney, the criminal justice system, and also the socioeconomic marginalization of Black people, which puts them in that position in the first place, which built that stigma over time, because, living in the inner cities and everything, that's, but.
So do you think redlining is the main cause of the segregation, at least where the formation of ghettos? Do you think redlining is the main instigator of that?
I think that's a big part of it. I forget who said it, but I was I was listening to a podcast or something by another politician or something, and they were talking about how one of the Democratic politicians or something said that they were going to intentionally use redlining to get to basically marginalize African Americans and keep them in the inner cities and then get them to vote for policies that would hurt them. I don't know. I
Mhm.
think, I don't know if I agree with all of the context around that. And I'm not going to get into that podcast specifically, but I think that, yeah, redlining is a large part of it because when you're living in poverty, you're more likely to resort to crime. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's only 13% of the population, 52% of the crime. So, and it's really not, it's, it's not an ideal situation. And I think it goes further up. It's, again, systemic racism and systemic disempowerment, like
Mhm.
in terms of capital, in terms of,
Yeah. So here, let me see. Um, do you think a candidate like Yang would have been stronger on this like police brutality point? Because I know, just going back to the jiu-jitsu point, he had advocated for more quirky positions, but I know like some of the other things. I know Yang, he had advocated for like demolition crews, because I know in Chicago at least, like part of the issue in these like slums essentially is there's so many abandoned houses and they're like dens for illegal activity. Like you'll have like people shooting heroin essentially.
yeah.
And like it would be like a government force that would go around and like essentially be a demolition crew in these like major cities where you have like population loss. So do you think that's like a good policy idea, even though
Well,
it's
I'm
out
not
there?
too familiar with Yang's policies, but I think that if you're talking about like renovating the inner cities and like getting rid of public housing, I mean, I think that can have its benefits. I mean, I think it's definitely like we need to bring some attention to that, and it's one of the ways we can help deal with poverty in our cities too. Um, I mean, yeah, I think I would. Again, I'm not too familiar with Yang's policies, but I think I'd be in support of that.
Mhm. So I wanted to pivot away from George Floyd, but to the case of the man who's recently shot by a police officer in Georgia in the Wendy's drive-through. And I know it's kind of a different situation after analyzing it. We do have footage, but not of the incident happening. But I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
All right. Well, I mean, I haven't seen the footage from that. And I haven't,
Mhm.
I'm not too familiar with that incident. Like, were you gonna pull something up really quick or no?
I can pull up the thing right now. So the
Like, you can
Georgia
screen share or
shooting.
something. Because I mean, honestly, like, I'd have to like really like, I don't know if you want to like actually show it on here, but
Yeah, so I think the main issue is, so I'll just explain it, but I'll put the link in the doc as well. Um, but in Atlanta, so he was in the Wendy's drive-through and he was sleeping for some reason. I think it was like 1:30 a.m. And the Wendy's an employee at the Wendy's had called the police officers, and they went out there, and then he got out of the car, and they were arresting him. They believed he was intoxicated, I believe. I'm not sure if that was the grounds for the arrest. So they were beginning to arrest him, and then he ran out of the cuffs, and then he had taken the officer's taser, and then he was running. And while he was running, he aimed the taser back at the officer, and the officer then shot him. So in this article, it goes over how like the police training director had said that it was justified in a sense, but in not legislation, but in the rules of the police departments generally, it's deemed you can respond with excessive force if you feel there's a risk to your life. So I feel it's kind of a different situation, but he didn't have it under control to
oh, I
begin
think
with.
it's unequivocally it's a different situation, 100%, because there are so many different variables in an encounter like that, especially where they're resisting arrest, and first of all, if the police officer had the right training, he wouldn't let the guy get his weapon in the first
Yeah,
place.
that's true.
But once it's at that point, so there's this lack of proper training. There's this lack of proper, like, there's a lack of proper experience and protocol to handle the situation that leads to this point of escalation. And at that point, there's really like there's not a lot of options, and at that point, you're not thinking straight. It's I think in that case, it's 100% different than what happened with George Floyd. But
Hmm.
again, I think proper training would help a lot with that. And like it's also pretty common, like when people like fall asleep in their vehicles and they leave it on. Like I've seen cases with that where police have knocked on the window or whatever, and basically you don't want to fall asleep in your vehicle in a parking lot. I mean, because
Hmm.
there's that can actually happen a lot. It's kind of common. which I found interesting. I found that there was a case during my legal internship where this guy was sitting in his car and stuff, and they thought he was intoxicated, and so they arrested him on like some charges. But anyway, little side road there. But yeah.
So on that point, we've seen with the recent controversies with George Floyd and this Miami shooting, and I know not Miami, Atlanta, and there have been other instances that there's been a rush. I know in Seattle, at least, with the anti-police sentiment, we've seen 35 police officers take early retirement. So one of the issues I find, at least with the defund police movement, is one, it pushes away a lot of the police force that might be good cops. Like you can say whatever you want about all cops being bad, but it pushes away a large sum of the police force. And then it dissuades new people from wanting to be police because they know that they'll be painted in this negative light. So what I wanted to say is, how do we want to bring good new officers forward given the current sentiment into the job?
Well, I think a lot of what like the anti-police sentiment is doing is it's continuing to balkanize society into like, like cops are bad. The rest of us need to like unite and get rid of that. But you're not focusing on the actual systemic racism in the criminal justice system. You're not trying to actually empower Black people. You're not trying to get them into those positions of power in the criminal justice system. So you're not giving them the opportunity to, you know, like the police officers who do commit like police brutality. And again, it goes on a case by case basis, I believe, but they should be prosecuted when it's fit. And the way we do that is by getting, Black people and people with who share that pro-Black point of view into positions of power in the criminal justice system, not by completely dismantling the police force and trying to have like, Antifa advocating for anarchy and so on and so forth.
Mhm. What are I had two thoughts, but I want to go with this first one first. What are your thoughts on the in Seattle, what's going on right now with the occupation zone, the Chaz?
Sorry, can you read that really quick?
The Capitol Hill occupation zone, or it's the autonomous zone, Chaz. So essentially, they've taken over a 6-block
Oh
precinct,
yeah, I heard
and
about that.
yeah. What are
Yeah,
your
I
thoughts on
mean,
that?
I think again, it just goes along the lines. I think it's destructive for society, and I think it's, I mean, it's just. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see the protests kind of start to die down. We're
Mhm.
gonna. I think this is kind of an ephemeral thing. I think Black Lives Matter is always going to be a movement, and I think that's a good thing. I think there's a lot of Black Lives Matter is a, I'm in support of Black Lives Matter for the most part, but I'm not in support of like the more radical ideologies that are part of it or associated with it. But I think that the protests are going to calm down. I think that eventually this is going to blow over, and hopefully we can start working for like tangible change in the future.
Mhm. I think one issue, especially with I'm forgetting on the name, it's Seattle, I think it's Seattle, is that the police chief wanted to maintain the precinct, but they had gotten orders from either the mayor or I don't believe it's the governor, but the mayor. So the mayor had overstepped the police chief saying, you have to pull back from the zone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of the issue is that they're not, this is specifically in the Seattle case, they're not able to do their job. And I think part of the issue nationwide, at least, is you have police officers in this role of doing the most minor things that they might not, or they shouldn't be doing, like investigating like domestic abuse scenarios and stuff like that, where maybe a police officer isn't as well equipped to handle that type of situation. So what are your thoughts on like handing it off to like more social workers?
Well, I mean, well, if we were talking about Seattle, I think that I'm not really. I think the mayor of Seattle. I mean, like I know Trump condemned his actions
Yeah.
already. I mean, I'm not a Trump supporter myself, but I think that there's better ways you can handle that situation.
Hmm.
But I think that as far as like, I don't honestly know. So you were saying as far as police officers investigating like domestic abuse claims or something?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that a lot of cases that might, you know, that might just lead to more violence, like
Exactly.
especially if they're not competent and they're not well trained, if they're going into a situation that's already like flared up and they're putting themselves in that position, you're potentially risking exposure to more violence. So I think, yeah, I haven't thought about that too much, but I think that's an interesting point. I think that
Mhm.
I think that maybe there might be tighter regulations in order there. But I think that at the same time, if there's a 911 call or something, and they have to go investigate it. I mean,
Mm.
but,
I think one issue that we see, a lot of people are raising like the 40% domestic abuse statistic, that like 40% of police officers like are wife beaters essentially, but they don't actually read the paper where it says that. And it says it is these police officers bringing home the societal issues that they face in their job and then them reflecting it on their family. So I feel if we didn't have the police officers dealing with these domestic abuse scenarios that, one, they're not trained for, so maybe if they were trained for it, they'd be better able to deal with it, or two, we have social workers dealing with these domestic abuse scenarios where if it's not like to a deadly point, we have it be able to de-escalate with someone with the proper training. That way we don't reflect negatively on like the whole batch of cops,
well,
and we would actually bring progress.
I think when it comes to actual like domestic abuse, that's a
Mhm.
yes, you're influenced by trauma, you're influenced by the stuff you see, but when it comes down to that, there's no excuse for domestic abuse. And
Yeah.
we can't say that, you're exposed to that and then you bring that back to your house. I don't think that's the right mentality for that. And again, I know a lot of really good cops, they have happy families, they're, they manage to keep that part of their life separate. And, I think, I think part of it is also taking care of the mental health of police officers and you know having a strong support network, especially during these times, and just having a strong family support network. And um, yeah, and I'm not sure. I've heard the 40% statistic, but I haven't looked into that anymore, so I wouldn't know for sure if that's actually accurate.
Mm.
But it makes sense why it might be a little bit higher with police officers, just because of the power dynamic,
Yeah.
and the demographic of people who are usually appointed to you know positions of power like that. And what I'm trying to say there is, I'm not trying to say that it's like police officer positions attract bad people. What I'm trying to say is that if you're a person in a position of power, there's a chance that you might be more inclined to abuse that power, like within the family too. So
Mhm. Just I wanted to pivot to the funding situation. So we have people advocating for defunding, and then we have people who are kind of wary of that. And then I see like two scenarios here. So I think we can all agree that they should be getting better training. And in my mindset at least, there's either they're spending the money they have right now on the wrong things, i.e., it should be being spent on training, or two, they're actually not getting enough funding towards these training scenarios. So, which scenario do you think it is?
I mean, I agree with that. I think that it's going to take a lot of investment. It's going to take time too if we're actually going to. And again, it goes beyond just training. It goes beyond like I I believe there should be like um at least like I mean, you have to like train more to be a barber than you have to do to be a police officer at times. And I think that like if you're going to be a social worker, you have to go to school for like upwards of 4 years. So I think police officers should be required to have a I don't know, a pertinent degree, whether it be in like social working or I don't know, conflict resolution or whatever it might be, conflict resolution. But you know what I mean. But and then there should be like physical training with that too. But I think that in terms of practicality, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure at this point.
Mhm. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with the whole protest going on right now, or do you want to delve into Corona right now?
Well, again, I'm all for peaceful protesting, and uh, I don't condone any violence against peaceful protesters. But when it comes to like looting or non-peaceful protesters, do I think that they should be able to use like tear gas or more dangerous weapons? Like they're talking there about they were going to bring like a sound cannon in at some point. I think that was just propaganda, but it was I mean, I heard about it. I don't think they should be allowed to do that. um, but I think that as far as peaceful protesters go, like they should be protected. I'm all for that.
I think one issue with the escalation point is we see the militarization of police, and they're having these weapons like the sound cannon, like the tear gas. And like you have like police forces and like I think it was rural New Hampshire, and they have like a tank.
Mm.
And part of it is where we have all the surplus from the Middle East wars. And we have these companies that are selling it to these domestic police departments because they have a demand. They have federal grants that make it much cheaper to buy like a Humvee or a tank, but they don't necessarily need it. So I think when you have something like that, you're incentivized to use it. Like I know Sarasota, we have like two armed vehicles um, that are like they're not tanks, but they're like one step below it, basically. And it's like, why do we have two? What was wrong with the first one? So it's just a very strange scenario, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I think just like, yeah, like you're saying, militarization of police is probably a bad thing during this time. But I mean, again, it's just, it's not an ideal situation. I think it's going to blow over and tensions are going to diffuse over time. And then hopefully we can start seeing actual change.
Mhm. So on this coronavirus point, I know Florida has actually seen a rebound. So it's a second spike. I'm worried to say it's a second wave, but you see in this graph I have here, it's specifically after the stay-at-home order expired. We have seen the second spike to now a record 2,700 new cases in a day. So do you think we're pulling back on the restrictions too fast, or what else is it?
Well, what I think is going to happen, like, and to your point, I think what's going to happen is we're going to ease up on these restrictions, and then there's going to be a larger influx of cases, and then we're probably going to tighten down on the restrictions again, and then there's going to be another wave, so to speak, after that, after we relax those restrictions, and it's probably going to go on and off for like about like a year or so. And the thing is, though, if we're just going on and off for a year, we're going to take a large hit to the economy. We're going to take a large hit, students especially, and to mental health as well. So I'm honestly not sure as to the best course of action, but I think the rough truth is either way, people are going to die. So,
Mhm. And I
um,
know one issue with keeping the economy closed is the not societal, but the impact at home of being locked down because you have increased incidents of domestic abuse, you have increased rates of suicide because people aren't working, they don't have like a will to live essentially. So, do you think coronavirus outweighs the risk? Do you think we should keep these stay-at-home orders, or do you think maybe some people will die, but it's better for us to keep the stay-at-home orders in place?
I think it honestly depends on the time frame of whatever preventative measures we're going to take. If we're going to take the quarantine seriously, then it might work. But again, I doubt it's going to be that effective because, like, okay, the 10 p.m. curfews. What about before then? The 6 foot apart. What about 6.1 feet? I mean, like, is it? It's just like we can do stuff to prevent it, but there's always going to be people out there, continuing to spread it. There's always certain other elements at play, and we're all vectors for the virus. Either way, we can be like 60% of us are asymptomatic carriers anyway, or 60% of carriers I read in that article that you sent.
Mhm.
So I think that I think, and then also then I read about the new mutation that essentially it's mutated spike proteins that allow it to bond to human cells easier. So we might be seeing a rise of cases, but it isn't correlated at all with increased severity. So we're actually seeing decreased hospital visits, but we're seeing more cases. So Dr. Anthony how do you pronounce that?
Fauci.
Fauci. He was saying that you want to look at the hospitalization rather than just the amount of cases. And if the hospitalization goes up, then we want to be more worried. But
Mm.
uh, yeah, so I think, depends. I think the way we're handling it right now is not ideal. I think we're just
Mhm.
going to drag it out a little bit longer and have more serious consequences as a result.
So, I guess building off what you said earlier, do you think there is going to be a second wave in the fall?
I think there's going to be increased cases for sure. Like, I think it's going to continue to increase. But as for the severity and as for the mortality rates, I don't think we're going to see a large increase there. And we also have to look at like not just the number of cases, but the amount of tests and the percentage of positive tests. And if the percentage is rising, then that's of course, a reason to be more afraid and take more preventative measures. But if the percentage is just staying the same and we're just having more tests done, then that might be a reason for why we're seeing more cases.
Mhm. I know the school board has been deliberating specific scenarios about reopening school next year. So do you think we should open school like the first day it was scheduled to, or do you think we should push it back or have some like hybrid approach?
Well, I think I might a little bit biased as a student, but for me, I think we should open it up right away because I know that there were talks about continuing with online learning for upperclassmen and then
Hmm.
staggering the learning for the lowerclassmen and middle schoolers. And I think that would be probably the worst possible thing that we could do for upperclassmen, especially like if we're all like AP students, students in dual enrollment classes. Like you don't want to do that online. Like
Yeah.
the last quarter of online learning was a complete disaster, in my opinion. And I think if we continue to handle it that way, I think the school board is making a big mistake. And we are starting to see more cases in younger people, like around the like early 20s. I think is where it's starting to increase some more. But so I mean, I guess we're putting ourselves at risk, and we're also again we can be asymptomatic carriers, and we are vectors for the virus in society. But I think as a student, I would rather just get right back to school because I'm like for me and for everyone else, I don't think we want to put our lives on hold like that. And again, that might be selfish and it might be callous in the long term, but well, we'll have to see, I guess.
Mm. I think one issue, I do agree with you about reopening school, but I think one issue with that is if we see at that point we have the fall, so it's a colder temperature for the start, so you have a longer period for the virus for the wave,
It
let's
can,
say. And then and just so on the first wave we went into quarantine at a much lower case count. And I feel since so few people have been um, given the virus, I think it's like 5 to 10% of the population, probably less, that it's just a new breeding ground. So if we have the even higher case count when we start, I think it would kind of explode in a sense. So what do you think?
well, I mean, we could definitely be seeing a much larger second wave or even like another wave after that, but I don't know. I think for all people in America, I think life has to go on at some point, and we can continue taking preventative measures, but there's only so much that we can do. And and again, that there's a lot of problems with that mentality. Like I mean, like there's like even theoretically, if we were to reach herd immunity, that would be a lot of deaths. Like I think close to 2 million or more. I think I forget where I got that figure from, but it was either 2 million or more than that. But it would be a I mean, I think well for me, I think reopening is probably the best route, but we might see more cases.
Mhm. I know, I'm just trying to think right now. So if we had to think in hypotheticals, if we had to have a hybrid learning approach, I know Manatee County has had thoughts about having like younger kids in the morning and then older kids in the evening so that you don't have that cross contact between the students and you can spread them out over the same amount of facilities. But I know the Sarasota County um, board essentially said it wasn't feasible. So if you had to have a hybrid approach, would you prefer like the morning and evening or morning and afternoon rather approach? Or would you prefer like the staggered with high schoolers just not going to school at all?
Well, I think that if we're going to have anyone just doing solely online learning, it should be the lower classmen, like ninth, 10th, and middle schoolers, because at that point it's not as important.
Mm,
Because we're like as upperclassmen, we're on our way to college, we're taking more rigorous courses, we need to have close contact with college counselors and resources, especially like at this point. We need to be having access to the resources for preparation for like standardized tests. We need to be able to study. We need to be able to do well on AP exams. And I think ultimately, like upperclassmen should be prioritized in this like situation. And then we should, figure out a hybrid approach for the middle schoolers and for like for Pineview. I mean, like I know other high schools, we're just planning on doing a split approach where upperclassmen don't go to school in person. But with Pineview, where we have middle schoolers and elementary schoolers, I think that might be a much larger problem. And it
Mm.
would also put a large burden on families to homeschool their kids, especially like elementary students. So that's the other side of the coin there. But so an ideal approach, I mean, at least the way I see it, I think middle schoolers are probably capable of doing a large portion of their learning online, as well as maybe like freshmen and sophomores. But for upperclassmen, it might work actually. For upperclassmen, we could actually share classes in person with the local junior colleges, like other campuses, because I know there's students who go there for dual enrollment classes, and we could potentially use, like for in Pineview's case, where we have all these students over a wide variety of age ranges. It'd be helpful, I think, to have the upperclassmen, using two different campuses also. Um, Again, not ideal, but it's an idea, and then we could figure out what to do with the elementary schoolers. And again, I think elementary schoolers, I didn't think about that with Pineview because they're young. It's a large burden for the family to try to be responsible for their education, their food, their whatever, and also it's just it's definitely a complicated situation.
Yeah, I know one of the main reasons why the school board in Sarasota just didn't like the staggered idea at all is because you would have the younger elementary kids at home for part of the day. So their thought was, well, if they can't pay for the home care for at least part of the day, it'd be better if they were at school the whole day. And high schoolers can take care of themselves in a sense at home, and you don't have to pay for like daycare. But I do like your idea about working with the community colleges. I hadn't actually thought of that because we do see like the open enrollment in a sense at colleges like SCF and using the facilities. They would just need to be more accepting because I know at the state level they can kind of push for that kind of move, but right now we haven't seen any move from the state level since we were put into the quarantine. So if that were theoretically to be put in place, it would have to be at a much larger scale than just Sarasota. Because
Yeah,
I think we only
or
have like SCF.
or it would have to be like individual students taking initiative to take
Mm,
classes, and then it would just be about like awareness for students who wanted to do that. I was thinking about myself doing like there's like an ADE program, like a dual enrollment program that you can take, but you would have to have registered for it before like May 18th, I think the date was.
mm.
So maybe if we got enough pressure, we could get the junior colleges to extend the deadline or work with whoever to potentially take more applicants for that, and you can still graduate with a Pineview diploma for Pineview
Mhm.
students.
And I think one big problem with the Pineview diploma is like I myself have been able to take advantage of things that you might not might you would not be able to do if like you were an underclass or not an underclass but a middle schooler and then going into high school with these new regulations. Like I only took 1 year of English on campus and I took English 2 through FLVS and now I'm doing DE English both last year and now I'm taking DE Lit, but I wouldn't have been able to do that because I would have had to have at least 4 of my core English classes taught on campus. Well, that leaves me no room for play. I would have to take English 1 through 4 or English 1 2 Lang Lit. And then I wouldn't be able to take all these other classes that I was taking. So I think the new restrictions kind of hinder us in a way with the coronavirus because you can't have that kind of staggered approach with the colleges when you have these new restrictions that require you to take them on
Mhm.
campus. It's kind of counterintuitive.
So I'm not sure about the way the dual enrollment program works at the community colleges, but I think the way that it works is you can kind of pick like it's almost like you can like pick a topic to major in almost, and you graduate with your AA, but you also don't have to take the required courses for Pineview graduation if you do it through Pineview, I think. So you can graduate without technically meeting the requirements that they put on the Pineview diploma. So, I mean, I don't know. I think this is all definitely speaking hypotheticals because I don't think that that's something that we'd necessarily be able to do unless it were something that the school board were to take an interest in. But
Mhm. Do you think there's any real value in the Pine View degree compared to just a regular high school degree? Because I know, like, the principal at least lauds it as something that's valuable, but I just don't see that compared to a college degree, at least.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you were to do the dual enrollment one, you would graduate with your degree and your Pine View diploma. Now, selective colleges like the Ivies and other state schools probably won't accept your degree, like going into their school, but state colleges in Florida, I think they will, most of them. But when it comes to just like, if you were referring to a Pine View diploma compared to other schools' diplomas, I've heard before that Pine View diplomas look better to schools in state, and I'm not so sure out of state, but I think when it comes to your personal benefits and your education, Pine View doesn't necessarily provide as much of a unique or meaningful learning experience at all. I think it's just busy work, you get your grade, and you go to college. And a lot of people like, who are like very, serious about providing a great quality of work, they can't handle Pine View's work volume because it's a lot of work. And like the only way I make it is by scribbling my homework in class under the desk because I have to go train for like 6 hours every day during the school year. So I mean, a lot of people can't do that. So that's why they have a much better experience at other schools. And it just depends on what works for you. Anyway, we
Do
got
you think
sidetracked.
do you think there's any real fundamental difference between, say, Riverview's IB program and Pine View's like threshold just to get in? But like, do you think they're comparable or really different?
Well, I think it depends on the classes you take. I think Pine View's AP classes compared to Riverview's IB classes, I think the IB classes are technically a little bit more rigorous. They're also like they're intended to be like followed through over like a I think it's the last I think you take pre-IB classes when you're a lower classman, and then you do IB programs your last 2 years. Whereas at Pine View, you can just take AP classes as long as you have the prerequisites. But I think the quality of instruction depends on the teacher, and the quality of work is generally like lower and more volume at Pine View than with Riverview's IB program. But I've heard that IB is a lot of like analysis and a lot of work, but it's like meaningful work. At least that's what I've heard.
I would agree with that because I know with the IB program, you have like the thesis that you have to do, your senior thesis, and it's like you're really putting your
So it's almost like
concepts.
college almost. You're like
Yeah.
studying something over a long period of time. And
It's a much better preparatory course, I feel,
yeah,
compared to Pineview because we're lauded as like a college prep school, but really the only thing that we're being prepared for is the amount of work we're doing, not like the type of work. So I
exactly. Yeah.
feel the IB program has an advantage in that sense.
hmm And honestly, like if I'm studying something that I'm interested in college, I'm gonna put a lot more, work ethic and a lot more interest into the stuff that I'm learning. So this kind of like, just like do the work, busy work attitude isn't necessarily great for preparing you for college either. I mean, there's a lot of busy work you have to do in college, but like hopefully it's something you're gonna be passionate about and want to pursue like a career in potentially. So
Hmm.
I don't know, but
Yeah. Let me see. I wanted to go to this specific case from Orlando. So, a woman in Orlando had a letter in the mail essentially saying that she had her social security number believed was leaked, and she had unemployment benefits being taken out in her name in Massachusetts, even though she had never lived there. And I feel it's part of a bigger issue with coronavirus, which I don't think will subside until it's completely gone. That is, we have more people being in unemployment, and we find them actually getting more money from unemployment than they would from their regular job. So, what are your thoughts on that?
well, I mean, there was like I forget where I heard it. I think I read it in an article, but the Department of Employment and Opportunity or something, didn't they leak social security numbers on May 21st or something?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, there's there's like a bunch of bad implications from that, of course, and I think that's, and then when it comes to like the stimulus checks, I mean, ideally, like we wouldn't have people like living off stimulus checks. We'd have people working. We'd have the economy keep like pushing forward as much as we could. But I guess our approach so far hasn't really been as heavily oriented in that direction for dealing with coronavirus. and I don't know how good the stimulus checks are really going to be for our country, but my hope is that um, they'll eventually be rescinded once we're back up and going, like you said, and once everything's stable. But again, we don't know how long that's going to take, and it's going to mean higher taxes for us over a long period of time. And it's for those of us who are still working, it's not the ideal. For those of us who have the ability to keep working, it's not ideal for to have
Mm.
other people like benefiting off unemployment and stimulus checks.
Do you think there's going to be another round of stimulus checks? Because we've only had the one.
Well, there. It depends. We were saying, like the coronavirus thing could potentially be dragged out for like a year or more. Hopefully not, but like we could definitely see more rounds of stimulus checks, and hopefully the DEO handles it well, or as well as they possibly can with everything else that's going on. But I don't even know if it's the DEO that's handling the stimulus checks, and the is it them, or is it something else? I'm not sure, but
Mm. Well,
yeah,
I
I don't
think
know.
one big issue is the viability of the stimulus checks. We saw a lot of people not receiving them either because they didn't turn in their tax forms or for some other benign reason.
Hmm.
And it really, with a one-time payment like that, it's not really helping people in the sense that it should, because you have a lot of people, again, that didn't receive it, or it's not on a recurring basis where they might spend it all on one thing. And one issue with the coronavirus, we can call it a recession, but it's not really a recession because it's forced by like an external thing.
Hmm.
So in that sense, we have the supply and demand. So when it's a demand side recession, people giving people money means that they'll then have the demand, like they'll have the capacity to then buy up the supply.
Hmm.
But the issue right now is that when people aren't able to go to the store, either because of restrictions or whatnot, then you have a supply side recession where no matter how much money you give an individual, how much demand there is, you're not going to be able to fix the economy because they're not able to get the supply. So I think it's kind of flawed with the stimulus checks as an idea to stimulate the economy because you're not solving the supply side. You're only trying to stimulate the demand. And I think there's always going to be demand for like flat screen TVs or food, but the supply is really the issue. Like we saw with the food, we saw like farmers like letting their milk and stuff just like go to waste because they can't pay for it to be transported to these places.
Hmm.
What
And
do
you're
you think?
also seeing like even with this, that's an interesting point, by the way. But also like even if you're ordering stuff off Amazon, you're still potentially exposing yourself to coronavirus. It's still potentially as dangerous as just going outside. And well, of course not as dangerous as going like outside with other people, but like if you like go to Walmart, I think the risk is about equal there, because like you never know. But to your point about the economy, yeah, I agree with that statement. I think the stimulus checks aren't really going to stimulate the economy, but like if there are people who actually can't pay for their basic needs, and they might have to like start taking more drastic measures, maybe the stimulus checks might help out. That was what I was originally thinking when I was like hearing about them. But yeah, it's not going to. The only thing that's going to re-stimulate the economy is reopening, and that's why I'm saying we're either going to have to decide to do the lockdown 100%, which is probably not pragmatic, um, or we're just going to have to keep reopening and face it as it comes. But
I have heard from some epidemiologists that they believe we should still be in full lockdown, but I think it's kind of not feasible because when you're in full lockdown, when the economy is shut down in that sense, you're hurting people much more than the lives you might be saving. And like every life is precious, but to a point, you have to do a cost benefit analysis of either we do the full shutdown or we have the staggered approach. But I think the opportunity cost of then rebounding back to a full lockdown will be much worse
I agree
because
with
you'll
that.
have
Yeah.
these pains of having to go back and then you'll have much more jobs cut. We see like between 25 to 50% of restaurants right now are going to close. And a big issue with that is we have restaurants right now in our current economic situation, they're not able to reopen, even if they can under current restrictions, because of the requirement like 25 or 50% capacity. Their profit margins are so small, they wouldn't be making money because they'd have to order, I don't know, $4,000 to $8,000 worth of food, and you're only selling like $3,000 worth to your customers, and you still have to pay all your employees. So, in the case that we have like a rebound to the lockdown, we would see much more businesses being shut down.
And along those lines, like with the restaurants, I'm gonna go down a little tangent here, but I heard about this kind of a business model for restaurants that's starting where you have like it's basically like you have like a kitchen or whatever, and you can have it basically supplies the food for different restaurant chains or different styles, and you basically order it online and it supplies and stuff. So I don't know if that I think I forget where I heard it, but there was like an increase in that kind of model specifically. I don't know if that's something I haven't looked into it too much, but it's just a
Like
little
cooking
interesting
at
side
home.
note. No, like there's actually like a restaurant or something that is kind of like, and then like you can have multiple chains, like you know, paying to be able to use that distribution system or something.
Mm.
So it's like an independent thingy that's I don't know if I'm describing it well because I just heard about it somewhere and I thought it might be interesting. But yeah. Yeah, I think there are people who need to make a living and the stimulus checks aren't gonna cut it,
Mm.
essentially.
On that distribution point, I was actually thinking about this earlier. With the smaller restaurants that have these smaller profit margins, they won't be able to make it. But we see with like these fast food restaurants and these big chains, they have like the surplus in their. I don't want to say they have the surplus in their budget, but they have more wiggle room in a sense that they'll be able to make it past the pandemic. And one issue I feel is a lot of Americans subside on going to restaurants. They're not in the scenario where they can eat. They don't have like real meals with their family out. Just
Hmm.
part of a bigger issue. But going back to the restaurant point, we're gonna have all these small restaurants closing, and then people will be reverting to much more unhealthy options with
Exactly. Yeah.
fast food. So I think that's also people aren't talking about that, but fast food is so much worse for your body than these even other restaurant alternatives.
Hmm. Yeah, 100%. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think that I mean, it's the fast food chains are definitely getting more money. I think they're benefiting from this a little bit
Hmm.
more. Well, I mean, they're certainly not suffering as much as small businesses. And like the larger corporations are definitely, there's certain parts of the industry that benefit more. And I think as far as like healthcare and like, I mean, well, not healthcare, but as far as like public health, you might start to see some, deterioration there. But I mean, yeah, it's just gonna have to see where it goes, I guess.
And I think one issue on the public health side, at least, is we're all talking about these masks, but we're not talking about like your immune system and what you could be doing to bolster your immune system. And we see it's a lot easier for public education to say, oh, wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart. But we're not thinking about like the big ticket items like, oh, what are your vitamin intakes? So are you getting enough nutrients? People aren't actually thinking, well, if I were healthy, there would be a next to 0% chance
Well, I
of
mean, we live in
me
America.
dying.
Most people don't have that great health anyway. I mean, like, and
Exactly.
most people they aren't even aware of how to measure those different things. I mean, I don't even like, last time I do my macros and like my calories and maintenance calories and nutrients or whatever, I don't think I did. And I'm like a professional athlete. So, that it just goes to show, I mean, you don't really, most people don't have access to that education. And that's an interesting point. But I think people like to live in selective ignorance too.
Mm.
So, I don't think they'd actually take the initiative on their personal part to. I mean, I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to, you know, educate more, but I don't think we'd see substantial results from that. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of stuff you can do to boost your immune system, and also if you're getting more exposure going outside, you are boosting your immune system, but at the same time, you're not necessarily exposing it to like coronavirus. So if you get exposed to coronavirus, it's not necessarily making you stronger in resistance to that. But again, the mortality rates aren't rising, and the cases are rising, but we're also, we're performing more tests in hospitals, and that's why we're starting to see some of the cases rise. Um, and also because of the mutations too, we're seeing the cases rise, but the hospital cases are still going down. So,
And I think on that point, one, I don't want to say issue, but right now we don't have a selective approach to shutting down. We have everyone shutting down, and then we have this phased approach where we're coming back. But I think really we should have the older individuals with these comorbidities. They should be the ones who are staying at home for these longer periods of time, and then society is able to take care of them either through the social welfare net or through even their relatives, and then everyone else can go work, because then the people who are dying are these more elderly individuals, and you are in a sense able to build up herd immunity by the younger individuals going out into the economy, going out and contracting coronavirus, and they might be sick for a day, they might be sick for 2 days, but they won't necessarily die. And that's a much better approach to selectively exclude elderly individuals from the economy than to stop everyone from participating.
well, I think I would take it a step further to say that it's at your discretion. If you're afraid of getting the coronavirus, if you're immunocompromised, you have other comorbidities, then you would want to stay home and you want to take more preventative measures on your part. That won't be as effective as if a lot of people do it, I don't think, because like there's a lot of reduced effectiveness. Like, for example, if you have coronavirus and you're not wearing a mask and someone else is, I think that only reduces the chance of someone getting it by like 15%. But if you're both wearing masks, it reduces it by 70%. I forget where I saw
Mhm.
that, but I forget where I see a lot of things, but but um but uh, in line with your point, I think that definitely there should. But then it gets down to the point that, are we going to enforce stricter regulations on specific demographics of people, and what implications does that have for like the future? And like, should we really like, I mean, like for elderly people, and then also there are elderly people who are dependent on their younger family members for income, and then if they're going out and then coming back in, they're bringing it back there. So it's definitely like multifaceted, and you can't just like approach it unilaterally and say we're going to put the younger people out and get herd immunity there. I think if we try to reach herd immunity like within our whole society, then a lot of people are going to die, and that's probably not ideal. But I think I'm still leaning towards the side that we need to reopen, and we need to keep focusing on reopening and basically see where this goes. But
And I think one issue with it is that we see with coronavirus, we're seeing these mutations. And the problem that we have with the flu every year is it's able to mutate, that we have to make a new vaccine every year. And we have a basis to build off of for the new vaccines. But when we look forward to the coming years, we're going to have coronavirus every year on top of the flu. So, as long as not everyone has the vaccine, then you won't be able to protect the people who might not be able to receive the vaccine. So, it's either we have vaccine or we have herd immunity. And I know, as an example, in France, with the measles vaccine, it was like 99% of people had the measles vaccine, and that protects the 1% of people who aren't able to get it because of health reasons. And it had dropped to like 95% because of the anti vaxxer movement. And there was like an outbreak of like 5,000 people who aren't able to get the vaccine, and the people who are anti vax who then get measles. So I think herd immunity is a big part of it. And insofar as we don't have a vaccine, and I don't think we will get one until 2021, we should probably be heading towards herd
mm-hmm. And then we do have to look at the like the epidemiological implications there, but I think that you're right in that sense. I'm not sure how many deaths that would mean, but
immunity.
I mean, hopefully we're heading in the direction of finding a vaccine, and then building from there, depending on the different mutations, and yeah, I mean, ideally we would have a vaccine by the end of the year, and we would kind of have it stabilized, and we'd have most people vaccinated in the U.S. But again, I'm not 100% sure if that's going to happen. So I don't think anyone is, but
Do you think there's going to be a scenario where more wealthy individuals can buy a vaccine before the general populace gets it?
well, I mean, it depends on the distributors of the vaccine. I mean, like it's interesting. You sent me that article about like how pharmacies are starting to have more autonomy and stuff and distributing different modifications of drugs or whatever treatments. So it depends on which pharmaceutical corporations are distributing the vaccine, if it's in cooperation with physicians, if it's in cooperation with whatever. And it depends. I think it depends on that too. I think it depends on the pharmacies, and it depends on the way that pharmacies and physicians tend to work together. Because I was reading about that, and they said that they don't really have it worked out. But it depends on. I think we could potentially see that, but I'm not exactly sure what would be like, you know, the premise for something like that happening.
Mhm. I think the premise, I'm just trying to think in my mind, is since we don't have like a centralized vaccine like factory, we can put it that way. We have all these separate places where we're trying to get to a vaccine. There's always going to be a scenario where you have this high dollar price demand that they're willing to pay. And then
Mhm.
you have private industry that's eventually going to be able to provide vaccines in a limited scenario. So you have a limited scarce supply. There's going to be that interaction between the elites in getting a vaccine, and then it'll eventually trickle down when there's an increased supply. But I think unless the government takes a more centralized approach, which I don't necessarily agree with because it might stifle the overall research and development time that it might take, but if you're able to more centralize the distribution, I feel would prove very well in trying to like aid the societal rifts we already have between classes.
Well, I mean, I think the government should definitely be taking initiatives to centralize the provision of vaccinations and make it, especially like to get it to all parts of society, and like whether you're living in the inner city or whether you're living in the suburbs or whatever. Because a lot of people like won't be able to afford it. A lot of people, won't have access to it. So I think that's something that's the government is going to have to take. And then also you can take the top-down approach, or you can also take the bottom-up approach. You can have, grassroots organizations focusing on the distribution and dissemination of healthcare supplies and stuff. And we might start to see like the top down and the bottom up kind of come together at some point, and that would be interesting. But I don't know for sure. But I don't know. That's just an interesting perspective. But
So I wanted to get into this healthcare point that you brought up, but I did put in this article. So we do see this part of a bigger issue, not just coronavirus, but with healthcare practitioners, mainly doctors, were the ones who would be able to write these prescriptions. And I see you put this point about nurse protect practitioners, which I actually do agree with. But in Florida, we are allowing pharmacists to do much more with their role in providing healthcare because a lot of people don't actually realize, like pharmacists, they have a doctorate. Like even if they might not go to residency, they still know something in a
yeah,
sense. So do you think this is a good idea given the shortage of doctors, not just in Florida, but in the US?
well, I mean, I think there has to be regulations as to what exactly constitutes the collaboration between the pharmacists and the physicians. I mean, I also think that if there are like private pharmaceutical companies that are monopolizing the distributions of vaccinations, then that's not ideal because you get uneven distribution of the vaccines, and maybe like you were talking about, there's a high demand for the vaccine and there's low supply. Um, but I think there has to be terms for collaboration between the physicians and the pharmacists. Um,
Do you think in a sense pharmacists should be given the ability to write prescriptions even though they're the ones that are eventually giving the medicine?
well, I mean, I haven't done too much research on this, so I don't know what the different parts that would go into that debate are. But I think, I mean, we're definitely seeing more of that. Um, I think, but I think that I think that there should definitely just be we should like come up with defined terms for how pharmacists are to collaborate with the physicians and how what they're actually allowed to do with modifications to the prescriptions and what they're allowed to distribute. And I think that maybe then we can work from there, but that's about as far as the scope of my knowledge on this goes.
Mhm. I know one good thing, at least with the point that you brought up about the nurse practitioners, is that it's a lower bar of entry to become a nurse practitioner. You don't have like the residency requirements and
Mhm.
much lower schooling. And in their current capacity, they're only able to write like minor stuff. Like they can prescribe things, but not in all scenarios
Mhm.
where they might be able to given their current training. So I feel promoting nurse practitioners to kind of supplement the doctoral demand might be a good idea, especially given the current aging population, because there's going to be a huge boom. We think we have a lot of old people now, but once it's kind of a ticking time bomb in a sense, because all the people who like went to Vietnam and then
Mhm.
they're coming back, well, they have been back, but they're on the government dollar, their healthcare, and it's up to us as a generation to take care of them.
Right. Mhm. So yeah, we're definitely gonna see higher healthcare prices like that, and I think it, I think that could potentially lower healthcare costs if we uh, kind of supplement the demand like you were saying with nurse practitioners, and again, if they were to have increased responsibilities or increased discretion in how to distribute vaccines or prescriptions, then that would have to be in collaboration, or it would have to be decided upon prior. And I think, honestly, I think a centralized approach to determining the terms of that agreement would, or if that makes sense, like I feel like there should be a common understanding and a common like way to approach the collaboration between nurse practitioners and doctors, and in order to account for that, if that makes sense.
Mm.
I don't know, or maybe it might have to vary depending on uh, whatever like the economic situation is on a case by case basis, but I'm not sure. So.
I know one issue with the economy right now, especially with Social Security, is when Social Security was first implemented, you have one, maybe two people working for the health care of one individual who's receiving Social Security. But now we have so many more elderly individuals compared, at least comparatively, like in a ratio sense. To the younger individuals, it's like I think it's up to 30 young individuals paying for the healthcare of one person on Social Security, or paying for their Social Security and their healthcare. So I feel a dialogue was brought about in the 2016 Republican primary, which I think has kind of fallen out of favor now with the Trump administration because he never ran on the idea of balancing the budget. And but we do see in the distant future, not even so distant, but like the medium term, of these government programs failing because we keep racking up the debt, and these like essentially these bonds are going to fail when people realize the government won't be able to pay them back, and there's not enough individuals to even like be taxed in a sense.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense in simple terms, I think. And I mean it's honestly like could you so what do you think a good plan of action going forward from that would be like healthcare wise? Do you think that I mean especially if we do come up with a vaccine for coronavirus, like how do you think we should approach that?
For the vaccine, at least, I think the big issue is with the distribution. So once we have the vaccine, much like the testing, it's being able to ramp up how much we have and make sure that everyone has access to it. Because I know in the early days, people were saying, oh, we're not not everyone is able to get the test when they need it. And I feel with the vaccine, it's going to be a very similar scenario where not everyone is going to be able to get the vaccine when they need it, because in reality, everyone needs the vaccine. So once we get the supply distribution, and I know the current administration is like maybe even mobilizing the military domestically to not force people to take the vaccine, but to distribute the vaccine to more rural areas where it might be much harder to get people to have the vaccine. So I think centralization, which is what I was speaking to a little bit earlier, is really key for the vaccine.
Hmm. Yeah. And then as for like healthcare going forward, healthcare costs and how we're going to handle that. Well, do you honestly think that, do you think that Trump's repealing of like the Obamacare Act and everything, do you think that, how do you think that affected healthcare going forward? And do you think that was something that,
Well, I think one issue with that is the fact that in his first two terms, when he had control of both the House and the Senate, is his failure to actually repeal the Affordable Care Act, because it was so close. The House repealed the Affordable Care Act, but the Senate didn't, because I think during his first 2 years it was like a 51 Republican majority, so it's very slight. And the issue was under Paul Ryan in the House as House leader, he had passed a repeal plan. And you can say either way, like it might be better what Paul Ryan wanted. He wanted healthcare to be controlled at the state level with block grants, which is kind of more inefficient than at a federally mandated level. But you still, in an economic sense, it's much, much more sensible to not have all these people on the government dollar, because when you have the selective risk pools, especially with the Obamacare, you had people paying a minor fine, and we found the fine, we don't have the fine anymore. So you have the people who are on Obamacare are the people who need coverage, and the people who would be paying for that coverage aren't in the Obamacare pool, because you can choose not to be in Obamacare. So I
yeah.
think we're in this weird limbo zone right now between private healthcare and universal healthcare. And when you have a public option, when not everyone is in that, it's going to cost so much more for the government to cover this overhead, because you don't have these healthy people in the insurance pool, which is the concept of insurance. Like, for example, for car insurance, you have the good drivers and maybe the good drivers who might get in one car accident. So in that scenario, you have the good drivers covering the cost of the bad drivers, and overall, the cost for your insurance is much lower. But for car
Hmm.
insurance, if you're an at-risk driver, you've been in multiple car accidents, you're in a high-risk pool. And in that scenario, everyone pays much more. And the issue right now with our current distribution mechanism, since not everyone is in the pool, the people who are in it are the people who need the help the most. And that is reflected on what the government has to pay. So as long as we're not in a scenario where the government is getting either enough money or not everyone is in these federally mandated um, security net schemes, in a sense, we're going to have bigger issues coming for us.
Hmm. So you're saying that we should, so you're saying that, I don't know if I misunderstood your point, but are you saying that we should start moving towards privatization, or are you
No.
starting the other way around?
So I think in the long term, it'd be better to move towards the universal healthcare system, because it just takes care of much more people. And when you think about it in the long term, it's actually much more economical than the private healthcare
Mhm.
industry, because you have so much lag, in a sense, of money going through the insurance companies, going through the medical industry. When if at a government level, you're controlling the prices, I don't want to say price control, because price control isn't a good concept, but when at the federal level, everyone is in the pool, then you don't have the insurance agencies and you don't have the billions of dollars going to these companies when it could otherwise being reflected on the healthcare of the people, instead of that additional cost you're paying. Like a fraction of your healthcare bill, excuse me, is going to these insurance companies. It's not actually going towards your care, which would be solved
Right.
with the universal healthcare scheme.
Hmm. So that makes sense. So do you think there's any way to like, there's any economically feasible way to amalgamate the two, like to just increase efficacy and efficiency
Yeah.
while still mitigating price or
I
the
think
cost of healthcare?
one issue with the Obamacare right now, as we see it, it's not a public option. because the government itself isn't acting as a healthcare alternative. So Obamacare is where the government partners with private industry to sell their plans. So right now, unless we have a public option, which you could say is a better stepping stone towards universal healthcare, I think that it's true. But once the government actually provides its own healthcare scheme where you don't have to go through the bloat of the insurance companies, and where the government healthcare is at least marginally more inexpensive than the private insurance, you'll see people flocking to the government, and then you won't have that issue where all the high risk people are under Obamacare, because you'll have all the healthy people going under this coverage, and then it brings the cost for everyone down. And then it'll be much easier to scale that from a public option towards universal healthcare.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I wasn't too familiar with like the details of the Obamacare Act, and like the implications going forward, but I think it's definitely something that's really pertinent, especially now if we are looking towards the future and potentially getting vaccines. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know. I'd have to do some more research on that and see, really what. But
Yeah.
yeah, so.
The big issue right now with the insurance industry and the Medicare industry is there's so much bloat and there's so much overcharging. Like, for example, I went to the dermatologist, and under my healthcare, it's being covered. The meeting is covered. So, and then the dermatologist said, well, you have to come back in a month from now and you need to get like 2 biopsies. And I was like, okay. And then I go and I get a bill in the mail for the biopsies that are performed, $130. And I didn't even know I had an option that if I had known it would have been $130, I wouldn't have the healthcare cover, or I wouldn't actually have had the procedure done. So in that scenario, when you have that choice, that's part of the universal healthcare system, because you have, with these elective surgeries, instead of the cost being offloaded on you as a consumer, you're able to choose, like, I know how much this would cost if it's on top of my universal healthcare that I'm already receiving. So you have, like, in places like Canada, even if it might be inefficient, like you have to wait much longer to receive these procedures, overall, you're benefiting society much more when you enable that access at like a universal level.
Well, theoretically, like when you're talking about universal healthcare, do you think you're sacrificing the quality of healthcare for the ubiquity of it?
I think that there is some merit to that point, because one of the issues with the universal healthcare system is you don't have doctors being paid as much. Generally, you do have some outliers. And that kind of stifles innovation, because I know there was one, I think it was an FDA study, like 40 cures wouldn't have been produced if we were under like a universal healthcare model, because you wouldn't have that drive for innovation. And I think I was talking about this with someone else earlier, but the current issue right now is you have the US driving innovation, and then you have other universal healthcare countries in like Europe and even Canada that are just ripping off the innovations that are being found in the US and just making generic drugs out of it.
Mhm.
And the issue with that is, since patent law doesn't extend to these foreign countries, then we're not able to enforce the innovations that are being brought about here. So, one issue that I probably do find that I don't see being solved if the US moves towards universal healthcare is a kind of stagnation of the innovation that would be being brought about, because you don't have that new care being brought about, and you don't have that incentive for people to be really good at their job as a doctor if they're not being paid as much as they might.
Yeah, so along the lines of innovation, do you think it would be like efficient or pragmatic at all to like have like almost like a supranational like coalition of researchers or somewhat or whatnot, just and incentivize them somehow, so that way you can have that innovation pushing forward, but it would it wouldn't be necessarily like economically motivated, like you know I'm but I don't know, it's just a thought, but I'm not sure,
No,
but
that I do agree that is a good idea, because part of the issue right now is we have like the UN and we have the World Health Organization, and the issue with the World Health Organization and the change that they're trying to bring about is that it's aligned with a certain political entity, like how much money they put in or how much influence they have in the organization determines the outcome of what might be brought about. And in a scenario where we don't have everyone contributing to the World Health Organization, we don't have everyone giving money. It's the same thing with NATO. Like the US is spending the lion's share of money on NATO, so the US is the one that's dominating. We have the same scenario with the World Health Organization, where China is participating so much more than the US is in many aspects, not just money, where not everyone is benefiting. So building off the point you were talking about with an international like research collaboration, I generally agree with that, as long as everyone is contributing their fair amount. Because part of the UN is you have like your dues, but not every country actually is paying that portion of their GDP.
Right, because like you don't actually like I forget the way it works, but like you don't actually get like removed from the UN. I mean, you can like isn't it
Yeah.
something like you have to you can get suspended from like uh different like different like sub organizations like depending on whether you're paying your due or not, or different, or am I thinking of?
I think
Yeah.
you might be right, yeah.
And but like I know like a lot of the like the sub organizations in the UN, like the like for example, like you know when we were doing a Gatormon, I was in the one for I forget what it was. I think it was freedom of information, but the whatchamacallit, the UNESCO, like if you're not they have a subcommittee for freedom of information. If you're not paying your dues, then you don't get to be on the like the main council of the committee, and then you have to, and they cycle it out every 7 years or something. But but I don't know. Yeah, it might be a similar approach with the if there were to be like some theoretical like research organization. I mean technically the World Health Organization is kind of along those lines already, but we're not seeing that kind of thing from the World Health Organization,
Mm.
really. But
And I think one problem, like even with the UNESCO point that you bring up in the World Health Organization, as long as there's this, it even ties back to the healthcare point. As long as there's this selective participation in the program, there's going to be an inequality between what benefits we receive, because inherently, if not everyone is participating, the people who are participating are going to reap much more, like China was with the World Health Organization, than the countries that aren't actually actively participating. So I think with the UN, you don't have this like mandate for people to participate, and they're not either giving the money or participating. And when you kick people out, it's okay for them to be part of the organization, but then they're not being part of the organization, they're not participating.
right.
So the problem with the UN, since it's not a mandate and you're not requiring people to do it, they won't actually bring about real change. And I think I'd be hard pressed to think of one thing that the UN has actually done.
Yeah, yeah, I can agree with that. You know, definitely don't do Model UN because we want to, you know, but yeah, that's definitely a good point. I mean, the UN hasn't really done much more than aid and abet the,
Mm.
you know, but I don't know. It's just something I was throwing out there, but I don't know. It's definitely an interesting point. So would you say that you're like, would you say that going back to the Affordable Care Act, do you think that that's the right approach the government's taking for now? And what are some ways that we can make that, you know, more
Well,
practical?
I think one thing that, because initially when we look back to Obama's first term when Obamacare was passed, is it was it was a concession to the more conservative Democrats who, because initially Obama wanted it to be a public option, which makes more sense when the government is the one who's providing the healthcare.
Hmm.
But he had to concede, even though there was a large majority of Democrats in both chambers of Congress at the time. But it is a stepping stone. I do agree with that. And that's part of the reason why we saw senators like Bernie Sanders, even though he isn't for the Affordable Care Act in the sense that it's still private companies that are paying, or private companies that are administering the healthcare. He still sees it as a viable stepping stone towards his ultimate goal, being universal healthcare. So I feel building off that in the next few years, even if likely we'd see a Joe Biden presidency from the current projections we
Well,
have right now. So in that case, I think it doesn't make sense to leap to universal health care. I don't
well,
see
no.
the legislature, I don't see Congress doing that, but I do feasibly see them going towards a public option.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like I know that like as far as my parents go, they weren't necessarily for universal health care,
Hmm.
just because of they're not in that pool. Well, they're not in that pool per se of the people who have to like pay more in the private healthcare. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm interested in to see where it goes, and I'm gonna have to definitely do some more research on that to see where exactly I stand. But it's definitely an interesting topic, and especially right now. So
Hmm.
yeah, and
And I know I just brought up one point. Who would you think, from current projections, would win the 2020 election?
well, I mean, I haven't really taken too much of a big look at current projections like recently, but I feel like the Democratic Party is too divided right now. I feel like we might potentially see another Trump presidency, but
That's a good point. But after analyzing the specific swing states and the states that Trump won by such a small majority, specifically in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and even Florida, where it's like less than 1% in these states
Mhm.
that he had won. And even if you have like a couple thousand people in each of these states that become disenfranchised to vote for Trump, or if you have Joe Biden increase the turnout by such a small portion of people, given this economic crisis we're in, given coronavirus, they might think Joe Biden is a candidate compared to uh, uh, Trump right now, who would be able to help my issues. So maybe I will go to vote in
Mhm.
2020 compared to 2016.
Well,
That
perhaps.
I would see Joe Biden winning in that scenario.
That's interesting. I mean, he has trouble forming a coherent sentence, but
Yes. Yeah.
at least he's not, But I don't know. It's kind of funny, but well, I guess again, we'll have to see. I haven't seen the projections. I'm not. I don't have a solid prediction, but I mean, as far as I've been concerned up to this point, I figured that from what I've seen, the Democratic Party is spread pretty thin right now, and we might potentially see another term with Trump. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think one thing that kind of lends credence to what you're saying about him not being able to form like coherent thoughts is a big upheaval. I feel would be the debates between Trump and Biden, because if we have a scenario where like if we look back to 2016 at least, Trump didn't like KO Hillary in the debates because you had like the Trump style and you had the Hillary style. And whatever poison you had picked before, you were probably going to leave the debate still thinking the same, like, this is my candidate. But in the 2020 debates, where you have that reflection, like the Trump style going up against Biden, if Biden isn't able to propose or try and get across what he's trying to say, I think Trump could really knock out Biden in the debates, because we saw him like, I don't want to say completely inept in the Democrat debates, but he was like he was thrown like softballs, debate after
Mhm.
debate, and yet he couldn't answer those. And
Yeah.
any crosstalk, the other people were scared to question him. It rarely happened. But I feel
Mhm.
Trump will like hit him
Oh
very
yeah.
hard.
Hmm.
And I feel personally that that might be a big tipping point,
Hmm.
especially with so many people inside that would be watching the debates.
But again, there's so much like anti-Trump sentiment right now that those people aren't going to watch the debate and then decide I'm going to vote for Trump. Those people are like, we're getting Trump out of office.
Mhm.
But then there might be the people who are like, you know, kind of like on the edge. But I definitely do agree that Biden is going to get grilled
Mhm.
because he definitely has trouble in that department.
And
And
on the yeah.
oh, I was just going to say, I don't even know how competent of a president he would even be. But I mean, anyway, you were going to say.
In a sense, I had 2 points, but I want to go with the second one. In a sense, when you're voting for Biden, it's so crucial who he picks for VP, because when you vote for Biden, you are voting for the VP to potentially be the president, because we see Biden in such a state where like he might die in office, or
Yeah.
when he has like sort of vowed to not run for reelection. So if he wins, then in his second term, the automatic front runner is whoever he chooses for vice president, whoever
Hmm.
it might be, because they have the like elite qualifications as vice president.
And by the way, Trump is
So
still running with Mike with Pence, right?
yes, yes, and I think one flaw right now is we see if Trump loses, then the front runner is still Mike Pence. But why would you want to vote for Mike Pence for a theoretical 2024 election if Trump lost in 2020? It would be part of the same ticket.
Right.
So just going back to what I was saying previously, one thing with the VP, it's kind of crucial when you're voting for Biden. You're not just voting for Biden, you're voting for their VP, you're
No,
voting
yeah.
for their cabinet and who they might appoint to the Supreme Court. So you have to think
Right.
of like the overall calculus of your
Mhm.
decision making.
Exactly. Yeah. hmm But I don't even know. Like, I think that's an interesting point when it comes down to who I would vote for if I could vote. I don't know if I would. I don't think I would vote for Trump, but because I don't really believe in a lot of his policies, as far as like on a few different levels. But I mean, like economically, his policies were, they kind of aligned with my family's like socioeconomic status to a degree, but otherwise, I don't think I wouldn't vote for him. But when it comes to Biden, I would have to like look at his cabinet. I have to look at his vice president. I would have to look at because I don't really know. I don't really have a lot of faith in him as a potential candidate for presidency. I don't
Mm-hmm.
really. I wouldn't want to vote for him, but I guess depends. Like pick your poison.
Mm-hmm. And I think going back to the debate topic we were going on, one thing I feel so many people will be watching these debates is we've actually seen more people registered as independents. Now, this is a recent thing, more people registered as independents than there are people registered as Republicans. So you're going to have a lot of people in that middle section. It's like over 30%, I think, are registered independents in the US that haven't made their mind either way between Trump and Biden. And it's really going to be the decision point because unless Biden is on like some like super stimulants that are somehow making him like stand out compared to his previous performances, I don't think he'll be able to stand toe to toe and convince those middle percentage points of people who are independents to vote for him compared to Trump.
Yeah. So I wasn't aware about that 30% of independence. Like, I mean, I knew
Mhm.
there was like more independence, but I figured that right now there's just so much anti-Trump sentiment going on, especially with the Black Lives Matter protests. I figured that like a lot of American society is diametrically opposed to Trump and whatever he stands for, and a lot of times without, but so I don't know. I don't know for sure, but you bring up an interesting point there because like we might definitely see Trump grill Biden, and then we might see some people from the independent parties vote for Trump. But I don't know.
And I feel one issue with the polarization that we're seeing right now is we have no diversity of thought. We have one party will take up one position and then the other party will be diametrically opposed to what they're saying, even if the idea might be an overall good idea. Because
Right.
the current political climate with the parties is they have to oppose each other in order to both appease the politicians and to appease their voters. Because why would a Republican want to agree with the Democrat?
Yeah, and I think that system might be fundamentally flawed to a certain extent. I mean, it's like, I I think that especially right now, political tensions are like at a like at a seasonal high, I think. And I think that Trump staying in office would probably escalate those tensions further. I mean, I think as far as the protests, I think they will die down to a certain extent, but I think there's definitely going to be a lot of tension and a lot of angry people if Trump gets reelected. And
Mhm. And I think one point, I think part of it is the media portrayal of these protests because we see they've kind of fallen out of the limelight because we're going back in a sense to coronavirus as the main topic point. But like in at least Washington D.C., I know like there are still protests going on every day, and like even in New York City, we have protests every day, and people aren't looking at it, but it's still happening.
yeah,
And part of the issue is the media kind of like aiding this polarization that's happening, and I think a lot of it was brought about by Trump, because at least in the Bush years, I don't want to say it's good because a lot of the bipartisanship, like especially with the Patriot Act, wasn't good. But you had the political parties at least agreeing with each other on some things. But now they if they agree with each other, it's like what's wrong with you? Why would you agree with the other party?
right, yeah.
So it's kind of a polarization which I feel wasn't just brought about by Trump, but it's being enabled by the media.
And I think that's part of why we maybe alienated so many people that are now identifying as independent, and
Mm,
why that might be like a a wild card in the elections coming up. But I don't know. I think it's I think that we're gonna I think my bet is still on Trump for winning the 2020 elections. I don't think that will necessarily be a good thing, but I think it's probably what's gonna happen.
mhm. And I know it really depends on what analysis you use, because eventually it's very difficult to actually predict an election. There's so many deciding factors, like even between individual people, that there's no way to actually predict. Like even with polling data, it might not actually be representative. So I think in a sense, it depends on what perspective you view it through, because I know if you view it through like a primary model, like you might interpret Trump to win. But if you look at it through, I think it's the Oxford economic model, uh, Biden would win. And if you look at it through a polling view, um, Biden would win too. Do you think, I know at least in 2016, some of the polls were kind of off, especially in a state like Wisconsin where it was like outside of the margin of error. So do you think the polls have gotten better this year? Oh,
Yeah, I can't hear you. Hold up.
no, I got you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the screen. Oh, my internet connection's a little bit.
You're back.
What's up? I all right. Hold on. Let me see this real quick. All right, I'm good. All right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if the polling's been better. I don't. I mean, I think you're right that like if we're looking at it from a polling perspective, Biden might have the edge there. But I don't really know if the polling itself is getting like more accurate. Is that what you're
Mhm.
saying? But yeah.
I think one issue, at least looking back to 2016 versus 2020, like Trump, his win that he did achieve in these specific swing states was at least within the margin of error, except for Wisconsin. But now in 2020, we see Biden has such a lead, even in states that Trump had won, like Arizona and North
Hmm.
Carolina, where we might see like Biden winning in these states, not just these swing states that flipped from Democrat to Republican, specifically for the 2016 election, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but these other three states in particular, Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina, that might switch from Republican to Democrat just based off the
Right.
polling data. And from how it looks, not for North Carolina, but I know for Arizona and Florida, it looks like it's outside of the polling margin of error for Trump to actually win, which I think it's
Right.
quite troubling.
And these states that are still technically Republican that Trump has, he only has it by like a tiny margin, right?
Yeah,
Is that what you're talking
yeah.
about? Yeah. So I don't know. I think it depends. I mean, like I would I'm not too familiar with like the results of I mean, like the way the 2016 elections played out because I was like in sixth grade then. But I don't I don't know how it's I wouldn't know how to compare the two. But I think I don't know. You bring up some interesting points because I was thinking that maybe Trump might win because of like you brought up like in the primaries he's probably in the debates he's gonna probably grow Biden. I thought you know I kind of formulated that opinion that Trump was gonna win back during the Democratic debates. You could just kind of tell that they were
Hmm.
kind of you know and I didn't kind of check back in on that, but I don't know. We're getting close to the election, so I might want to. I'm not voting yet, though. Are you 18, by the way? Did you?
And now I will be. How many months will I be? One. I'll be 4 months off from voting,
Uh,
unfortunately. But I
who are
do
you
know
voting
people.
for?
If it would be difficult if I could vote, I don't know who I would vote for yet. That's I am. I think so much about those kinds of decisions. It would probably be up until like, I don't want to say the last day, but up until probably after the last debate that I would make a decision about who I would
Hmm.
vote
Yeah, I don't honestly know if I could trust myself enough to make a good decision, but I would definitely like once I'm definitely gonna vote when I turn 18. But
for. Mm. And I think one issue we find, especially with younger voters, is that they don't actually turn out voting. And when you don't vote, it even if you're boycotting a candidate, that vote then goes to the other candidate, because
Mhm.
that's the calculus. Like, if I don't vote for, let's say, candidate X in Florida, then effectively that's one less vote
For
that
them, and then
for
that's
them. Yeah,
technically like
it's like a vote
another.
for
Yeah,
candidate Z. So
yeah.
I think in that scenario, you should always vote, regardless of party. It doesn't even have to be a Democrat or Republican, as long as you're voting for someone who you truly believe in and you're taking
Mhm.
part in the democratic process. Because I know I don't have it in the doc, but what Obama said in one of his speeches, one way to make the country like just that much better would be if everyone participated in the democratic process and voted, because you would
Right.
have that representation. And right now, it's only at like a little bit over above 50%. It's so small.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, do you think that we're going to see more voter turnout in this election?
I do think we'll see more compared to 2016, because people were kind of apathetic about
Yeah.
Hillary, and there's not that much enthusiasm around Biden, which makes sense because he's pretty old. But I think there will be that enthusiasm either to oust Trump based off his decision making that he's had around either
I
coronavirus or the
think
protests.
I think that one of the most influential demographics is gonna be like kids right out of high school and college, who they're the most, they're the most easily influenced. They're have the most access to social media. They're being swept up in this kind of like mentality, like Trump is evil. We need to get him out of office, which is warranted in a number of ways. I'm not saying Trump's evil. I don't like the word evil, but he's probably not good for America. And I think a lot of young, easily influenced people. I think that's going to be a deciding factor. I think we're going to get more voter turnout because more people are passionate now about getting Trump out because of a lot of reasons. I think a lot of it's because of Black Lives Matter. A lot of it's because of LGBTQ, and those are usually younger age demographics.
Hmm.
But,
And talking about the younger age demographics, I found after speaking with people who work in like voter registration departments, one big issue right now, especially with the college age people, is their vote is actively being suppressed, because traditionally they're registered in their home state, but they might be attending a college out of state, or they might be attending a college and then they have a temporary address where they might be voting from, and then they're not registered where they might be voting from. So let's say if you're in Georgia but I'm from Florida, I'm registered to vote in Florida, I can't vote in Georgia for the presidential election. And oh, I just found that out a week before the election, I can't request mail-in ballot because it's too late. So
so where
we
did you hear
haven't.
that?
So
Because
just
that's interesting.
just generally after speaking with people, so the issue with colleges specifically is when you're moving from dorm to dorm, even if you set a temporary address, they won't send your ballot if you do mail-in ballots, because you can do that as a college student. Is they won't send it to your temporary address, and then in that scenario, your vote is not counted because you don't actually receive your ballot, and that's part of it. There's that kind of disenfranchisement, like you're not able to vote, and then there's such a barrier between that, like either registering or getting your ballot, that people just don't turn out voting. And that's why you see younger individuals aren't voting as much as the older individuals. So
Mhm.
just comparing the rates, I feel if younger voters actually realized what's being pitted against them and realized that they should be voting, then we would be in a much different place now.
Yeah, and I definitely think if that were the case, then Trump would not be elected.
Yes.
I think that that would definitely change the tides, and I think it might change the tides. Um, like even like without that much change, I think the younger age groups are probably definitely more, definitely less apathetic, and certainly not ambivalent. But I don't know. I think it's kind of it could tip either way. There's a lot of there's a lot of stuff that goes into this that I hadn't previously thought about. So I mean,
Mhm.
yeah.
And I think one thing that coronavirus really brought to light is the use of mail in ballots, which Trump has gone against, which I'm not sure I agree with because mail-in ballots, if we think about it on a basic electoral level, you have mail-in ballots which are written and then they're computerized. But when we look to previous elections, we have like recounts with these, excuse me, with these computerized machines. It's like there's a margin for error with the electronic system that you just don't have with like a mail-in ballot.
Mhm.
And we might look to the 2000 election and think it was bad with like the Florida, the hanging chads, and like the whole
Right.
election
Yeah.
hinged
The
on this
whole.
one thing. But we have to actually realize it's much better for electoral security to have your vote cast by paper ballot than it is for it to be cast electronically because
Oh yeah,
you
for
have
sure.
you have no guarantee that it's actually being counted, and you have such a difference between voting machines. There's no integrity between even counties in a state or on a state by state basis that I'm not sure where I was going with that thought, but just really mail in ballots are going to be much better for the election. And I feel not enough people are talking about the impact that it'll have.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, yeah, definitely. Having them like computerized introduces a whole swarm of different variables that really, you know, might mitigate the results. Or, yeah, I definitely agree that mail-in ballots would probably be a better option.
So I think we've kind of gone over the election. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I did want to go to this next topic. So the Supreme Court, I believe it was on Saturday, they just found the decision that the in a 6-3 with the leading opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, which was the first appointee that Trump made, um, which it kind of lines up with his previous um, legal theory. You would know that he would have gone with this, but people found it surprising nonetheless that a Trump appointee would have been for this.
Right.
Found that the Civil Rights Act now extends to people of different sexual orientations, meaning that individuals can't be discriminated in the workplace based off their sexuality. Now, people in Florida specifically, because currently it's codified in 22 states that people can't be discriminated against based off their sexuality for stuff like public housing and public accommodations. People think that DeSantis in the legislature, state level, should codify not only this in relation to the workplace, but also for
So
these
for like
public
public
housing and
housing too.
accommodation. Yeah.
I mean, I think I would agree with that 100%. I mean, down to like my belief system, I believe that like in America, you should be able to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. You identify as whatever you want. You can be with whoever you want, and that shouldn't negatively impact your like the obstacles that you have to face. And it shouldn't, whether that be like economically, whether it be discrimination, whether it be socially. So I'm 100% in favor of um, codifying that for public housing as well, and for other accommodations. So
Mhm. Building on that scenario, though, we do look to, I think it happened in Colorado, where the baker denied service to, I think it was a gay wedding, to bake a cake. So I wanted, do you think, because currently as it stands, you can deny service however you want because it's your business and you're the divide between the employee and the customer. So do you
yeah.
think companies should still be able, I don't want to say it's discrimination, but choose to selectively not provide their services based off whatever they might think?
Well, here's the thing. I believe that while you have the right I believe that private companies do have the right to, to make their own decisions about who they want to do business with. But at the same time, I think it might be time to start prioritizing combating discrimination.
Mhm.
It's definitely like, the way I grew up, I'm definitely very like um, pro like economic freedom and pro, private businesses should be able to make their own decisions and
Mhm.
determine their own values, whatever they might be. But at the same time, there's definitely a lot of pressure for, LGBTQ people like to, have equal privileges and everything. But then again, when we talk about equality and equity in all aspects of society, that's not always practical and it's not always democratic, whether you're LGBTQ or whether you're anything else or whatever your beliefs are. It's not always practical to have complete equality and justice all across the board. So it's kind of a, I don't know if it's really a moral debate
Mm,
or if it's just a ideological debate, but I don't think I would be able to come to a solid conclusion. I think I'd have to say that I'm undecided there.
mm,
It depends. If I were, I mean, like if I were a business owner, I wouldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. But I also believe that you shouldn't be discriminated against if you're, regardless of your sexual orientation. So I guess what it comes down to is if I'm a business owner, I don't want the government infringing on my right to decide who I want to sell to and who I want to do business with. But at the same time, if I'm a person living in America, I don't believe that it's right to be discriminated against on the basis of sex.
mhm.
So a little conflicted, but I think, you know, what's your standpoint there?
I think I like to think of it on an economic level because you have the US, which is traditionally thought of as a market economy where you have supply and demand are able to fulfill this need. So you have an unlimited need, and then you have a supply that has to be met by the limited resources that we have. And that's the whole economic idea of scarcity. So ideally, if there is a demand for something, it is illogical to not supply the people who are willing to pay the supply and demand price for it. But then you have to think of the US as a command economy when the US isn't following the traditional marketing like rules of supply and demand. The government has to step in with regulation in that scenario. And that's where you see, like, I don't like overreach, as you believe in economic freedom as well. Like overreach, like in areas like Cuba, where it's a total command economy, where the government determines what you make, how much you make, and everything like that. But you have to think of it, the US, in a hybrid economy because nothing deals in like economic absolutes. Like no market is truly a market, free market that is purely determined by supply and demand. So you do need a certain level of government outreach. And in the scenario of giving services, in the market ideology, you think if I don't provide services to this guy, then another bakery will pop up and be able to provide those services for him.
Right.
But we have to think, well, the world isn't as ideal like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have absolutes where maybe there might not be able to be another option. And it just doesn't make sense for there to be another bakery to provide services for maybe this area.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about it in that sense, there does need to be some government outreach. And I do agree with you. I am somewhat undecided because I generally don't agree with regulation if it can't be left to the market. But in a sense, it makes it discrimination in that sense shouldn't be tolerated. And if I can see a figure that I can point to that says this many people are being denied ability to some economic necessity, then I would definitely agree with regulation.
I think I can agree with that. I can also, and I think this kind of principle translates into the debate about like the Supreme Court bill that Trump was going to pass, where they were going to be able to allow this one organization to deny same-sex couples from adopting foster children on the basis of sexuality and religious freedom.
Hmm.
And I think in that case, that they definitely should not be allowed to deny
Yes.
the allowing them to foster children, especially like, and if you look at it like supply versus demand, there's a much larger demand for foster children and adopted children within same-sex couples just
Yes.
because of the nature of that. But I mean, so like in that case, there's no argument for me. But like when it comes to just private services, I feel that I I feel that I think at this point we should be prioritizing combating discrimination.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's
we have to
tough
be
to.
careful though, because like I mean, like, I believe in a market economy, and like you said, it's not, and it's like it's not an ideal model. There's going to be points where the government has to step in, but what I'm afraid of is it's almost like a trade-off. If we want justice, we have to sacrifice a certain degree of freedom and a certain degree of what America used to be economically, and maybe that's a step in the direction of change, and maybe that's where America's headed, or maybe we just kind of, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's right to discriminate on the basis of sex.
Mhm. I think building off that, you can't really deal with absolutes in any scenario. In a case where it is a mixed economy where we find ourselves right now, you do have a necessity for regulation. And I just wanted to build off that. So I wanted to move into this other article on. So we do see roads being painted and renamed in the name of LGBTQ solidarity in DC, New York City. And this article was specifically talking about uh, Key West. So do you think like this is more of a visual display of solidarity? Do you think this is really effective in raising awareness, or do you think it's kind of a scapegoat to get by without passing real legislative change?
Well, here's the thing. I think that the LGBTQ community should continue putting pressure for real legislative change, and they should keep focusing on that. But awareness is also important, and I think that it's great that they're doing that and they're raising awareness. But to a certain point, people who are like selectively ignorant or people who are either bigoted or not or ambivalent or uninterested, awareness only works to a certain point. It doesn't necessarily change people. So it has to, at a certain point, it has to come from the legislation. It has to come through actual like systematic change in the regulations and through government.
Yeah. And I feel one issue, particularly with DC, after looking at the news, and I could be wrong, of course, is that they painted the street with the rainbow colors, but I didn't actually see any legislation actually either passed or being considered in the DC area that would actually change anything regarding what the status quo was there. And I think one thing that New York was doing right, not necessarily in New York City, but what Cuomo is talking about at a gubernatorial level, it's like we have all this motivation for change. And he's like, change, I want change too. But write the legislation that actually brings about the change. And we will talk about that because you have all this, like, going back to economics, you have this demand for change, but you need to create the supply of the change that will actually happen because without that, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I think. I mean, like, well, it was Pride Month, and I think that a lot of that is just about like raising awareness and displays of like solidarity from the community. I think that's what part of that was, and also we did see that bill get passed in the Supreme Court for extending civil rights to LGBTQ. And I think that was definitely a step forward. And I think, I think that displays of solidarity are, I don't think they're not hurting the movement at all. I just think that they should also be focusing more on legislation too, like you said.
Mm. And I think one thing that the Trump administration is kind of doing wrong after watching the press conference where Trump was talking about it initially for the first time, and he was like, in regards to the Supreme Court decision, he was like, oh, well, we have to deal with it. It's like, well, do you not agree with it? Because just going against the grain of what has been set into code, it just doesn't make sense to not agree with it. Even on a moral level, you just go with it. It doesn't make sense not to agree with it. And then we have the Trump administration. They're not going to be building on it. It's really left to the states to make their own decisions, like
Mhm.
what Cuomo was saying. And I think people really need to take action. Like, this isn't going to solve anything. We still need to bring about codified change at a state level. That is what affects people much more.
Mhm. Well, if we're talking about the empowerment of like an entire group of people or like people spread out across the whole nation, I think that empowerment honestly comes at three levels. It comes within the sphere of the family, it comes from the sphere of the community, and then at the state level. and that those different levels of empowerment are social, economic, in terms of capital, in terms of opportunity, and I feel like those three different spheres intersect in different ways. So you can't just put it at the national level in the Supreme Court and then not do anything. I think
Hmm.
you have to work at different levels. I think those are the three main levels, like that where people are the most affected by discrimination, are the most affected by opportunities that result from their sexuality and identification. So, I mean, you can have to try to focus at those different levels because people face discrimination within the family, they face domestic abuse. A lot of times, people are who do identify differently or have different sexual orientations do like live in like traumatic home environments, and they have to deal with a lot more. Um, and that in turn generates more gender dysphoria. It generates more anxiety. It generates internalized homophobia, and it's just a lot of hardship that you have to combat at different levels.
Hmm. I completely agree. Yeah. It's hard to think that there is still that small minority in the sense that doesn't agree with what we're talking about in regards to extending rights to people on the basis of orientation. But I think, as with many issues looking back into the past, it's really an issue of age and the difference in ideals that people were raised with. Because, like, even with your political party, overwhelmingly, you are tend to be of the ideology or political party that you're raised under. And people who are older tend to have grown up with these ideas that are ingrained in their mind. And it's only left up to time for us to change what us as a society believe, because we can't
Right.
all of a sudden believe, like, convince all these people. We just have to wait.
So like the way I look at it, like I'm 100% pro LGBTQ, and like I'm 100% pro them having civil rights and equal access. But the thing is, that it extends past my personal belief. So even if I were a bigot, like, and even like, I'm gonna be frank here. I believe that biologically there are two genders, but
Mhm.
whatever you may choose to identify as, you have that right, and you deserve to be acknowledged. And you should deserve to have equal opportunities and equal access to things in life. And I don't think that people should be able to discriminate on that basis.
Exactly. So, for the last thing I wanted to talk about today is particularly the weather in Florida. So, this is kind of a forecast for like the next week, but in Central Florida, we're seeing high temperatures in the 90s with very little rain. I know we have received a bunch of rain, particularly due to the tropical storm Cristobal, which was the third storm of the season. But a lot of political forecasters I know before the season, earlier, I think it was in the winter, I had read, they were projecting this season to be particularly fierce. So, do you think before the end of the season, in more like August, September, do you think we're going to see more of these tropical developments affect Florida?
Well, I mean, we generally do around this time. We generally hurricane season kind of extends like past August, and then it kind of quells around the middle of August to September, I think, for the most part. I mean, um, and I think it's going to make tubing a lot of fun, and maybe water skiing if I get to that point. But uh, I think, yeah, we're going to see some storms. I think it's definitely kicking up a little bit faster right now. And I mean, I don't. I mean, I think it's gonna, it's just gonna play out like normal.
Mhm.
Might have giant hurricanes come in and destroy everything, and then we're gonna have problems, but hopefully not. I know
What
we
are
got a
your
tornado warning like in the middle of the night, and I was at my girlfriend's house, and it was like 1 a.m. and we like stayed all the way through. And we were watching Monty Python, and we finally like the tornado warning subsided, and like we went home at like 2 a.m. or something. So it was a lot of it was pretty funny. But anyway, you were saying.
I was just going to say, what are your thoughts on climate change affecting the occurrence of more, I don't know the proper grammar, stronger hurricanes and just more hurricanes in general?
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I'm definitely not an expert in environmental science, but I mean, as far as my understanding goes, it's very basic. If you're having global warming, then you're going to probably have larger storms because you're having more tropical climates, and then you're having like the winds, and then you're having like if it's over water, then there's more surface area for hurricanes to develop. Um, like if the temperature is right, um, and we could potentially be seeing larger hurricanes. Like I know what people were talking about. Maybe there's going to be a more severe hurricane season this year. Um, but I'm not. I'm honestly not. That's not my department.
Yeah, no, I think just based off what I've read, at least, there is an increased incidence mainly based off the temperature of the water and just the rate at which we will be getting hurricanes, purely based off the um, the kind of requirements necessary for a tropical development to occur. It just lends more because of the effects of global warming brought about by climate change. So
Yeah.
they're kind of go hand in hand in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose so. And I'm not 100% familiar with like all the like scientifically proven effects of global warming and climate change, but I'm under the impression that it will result in more severe storms around this time during hurricane season. And I mean, that's what it looks like up to this point. But yeah,
Exactly.
so
We have seen like bunch of like you think like 100-year storms or 500-year storms in the basis of like the past 10 years. So it's in that sense it's much greater frequency, I think.
yeah, yeah, definitely for sure. And also more intensity too with the storms like Irma back in like 2017. And
Exactly.
I don't think there's been a big one around Florida, but hopefully we don't see another one coming.
Fingers crossed. All right. Well, Dimitri, is there anything else you wanted to say before we ended off the recording?
um, Subscribe to my OnlyFans. Just kidding. No, don't do that. You don't want to see that. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I I think that I think we pretty much touched on everything, but I think this was definitely really awesome, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and everything. So
Oh yeah, of course.
thank you. Yeah.
And that's a